Item 1 is the land adjacent to Felsted Road and Bowers Road, Benfleet, Essex. Hand over to Kingfisher.
Thank you, sir. This is an application for a site to the south of Bowers Road and east of Felsted Road. It's an irregular shaped site, as you can see from the plan before you. It's well vegetated, crossed by unmade roads, has quite a steep topography, and is host to some 10 dwellings and a small number of commercial undertakings. The site has an area of approximately 8.7 hectares, and it's allocated currently for greenbelt purposes. It's proposed to develop the site with 178 dwellings, with associated access, infrastructure and public open space, including the provision of 2 areas of community woodland. In detail, the proposal seeks to provide 160 market houses. They're comprised of 9 5-bedroom houses, 128 4-bedroom houses, 23 3-bedroom houses, all of which will be 2 or 3 storey. And in addition, 18 affordable housing units comprised of 4 3-bedroom houses and 14 2-bedroom houses. The retained woodland would extend to some 1.7 hectares, and you can see that quite clearly on the plan. Vehicle access to the site is taken from Bowers Road. There's no vehicular access to the site from the south. Now, whilst this site is currently allocated for greenbelt purposes, it was actually one of the sites which was identified by members as being suitable for release from the greenbelt at the end of 2012. There can therefore be no objection to the principle of the development of the site for residential purposes. Objection is, however, raised in respect of the quantum of development which is currently proposed. Now, members may be aware that this site has been the subject of extensive pre-application discussions. They started back in early 2012, and in its early form, the proposal was presented almost as a series of residential pods set within a woodland setting. That was the concept initially presented to members in August of 2012. That concept, however, has been diluted subsequently as a result of the applicant modifying the scheme, coming back further discussions, and we are now at the point where you had the scheme before you, which represents a housing estate with some peripheral community woodland. Now, the report goes into significant detail on the various aspects of the proposal, and I don't intend to go over each of those aspects in detail. However, I think there are a number of points where some discussion is required. Primarily they concern the design and layout, the parking provision, the retention of the woodland, the ecology and the provision of affordable housing. In terms of design and layout, I think this scheme represents overdevelopment of the site. In itself, the scheme suffers from a number of fairly minor deficiencies in terms of garden depth, garden area, widths of roads, parking provision. Now, each one in isolation may not be sufficient to justify refusing this proposal. However, when you take account of their cumulative impact, the effect is such as to present this as a very cramped and tight form of development, which has a very poor layout and prevents a very mean and cramped appearance, which is unacceptable. The layout provides, for example, some poor relationships between dwellings and between the dwellings and the roads and between the elevations of those dwellings. Members will know that we have guidance now which concerns the ability of buildings to turn corners appropriately, to have interesting and active frontages. This scheme lacks those details. In terms of appearance, I think if we can look at the street scenes, the dwellings in themselves are reasonable in appearance, but as I've said, the relationship between dwellings is somewhat less desirable. I think if you can look at this sheet, for example, in the first and the fourth rows, you can see examples of where dwellings are built directly onto the boundary of their site. This produces a very tight urban form in an area which really, even within the residential area surrounding it, is quite open and quite spacious. in that context, this development would seem out of character. There are also examples of where we have very long stretches of brick walls around gardens, and members will again recall that in their residential design guidance we're trying to avoid having very bland and uninteresting frontages. The fact that it's such a tight scheme prevents us even introducing substantial landscaping to try and break up those frontages. So again, I think it represents the overdevelopment of the site. The site is also considered to be unduly dominated by parking. Now, all of the properties on this scheme can meet your parking standards in terms of the quantum. There are some issues in respect of consistency between the detailed drawings and the layout, which may have implications. The detailed drawings show garages to your standard. The layout drawing shows garages which are not quite your standard in a number of instances. Clearly that has an implication for how the development will look. There's also the situation where this scheme is served significantly by private drives. They're quite narrow, bring a very tight feeling to the development, and when you introduce cars into that very tight environment, the whole area becomes dominated by parked vehicles or by vehicular movements. And it's not considered that creates a very good environment, either visually or in terms of the functionality of this space. It should also be noted, in fact, the Highway Authority have asked for some amendments to the layout. In some instances, some of these private drives are some 3 metres wide. In some areas, the Highway Authority has asked for those to be increased to 4.1 metres wide. And again, you can see how that would have implications for the layout presented to you tonight. Now, on the positive side, the applicant is keen to point out the very significant element of the scheme, which is the retention of the 2 areas of woodland. These areas are to be maintained as community woodlands. They are to provide a recreational facility not only for the occupiers of the new development, but also the occupiers of the surrounding area. As I've said previously, it extends to about 1.7 hectares in area. And not only are these areas to provide recreational facilities, they're also to provide the ecological mitigation for the site. And I think there are some concerns as to whether that quantum of land could satisfactorily accommodate that dual purpose. I think that would need to be better demonstrated in any subsequent submissions. It should be noted that there's no parking provided to support the community woodland. And again, if this is supposed to serve the wider community, I think it's reasonable to assume that at least some would drive to the site. There is no provision for them to park anywhere within the site. We end up with lots of on-street parking in an environment which is already relatively tight in its urban form. And members may also remember the earlier pre-application discussions, there was some provision for a car park for the school, which members were quite keen on achieving. I'm afraid that particular element has been deleted from this scheme. That no longer forms part of the proposal. In terms of the wildlife, this area is heavily wooded at the moment. It's not a local wildlife site. It has no significant nature conservation value, but it clearly has some nature conservation value by virtue of its nature, its treed presence. The applicants have proposed bat boxes and bird boxes, which would assist in replacing some of the habitat loss. But there's very limited mitigation in terms of the badgers, for example, which are present on the site. There are some 6 badger sets present. I think 2 are stated to be inactive. There's 1 main set and a number of outliers. The intention is to close 5 of those sets, leaving just the main set available for the badgers to use. The applicants acknowledge that this may have some impact on the foraging patterns of the badgers, but they believe that those badgers will just move elsewhere. I don't believe that that particular mitigation strategy has been adequately demonstrated, and there is therefore an objection to the proposal based on its lack of ecological demonstration. Finally, in respect of affordable housing, currently your policy seeks 35%. On a scheme of this size, we should be looking at something like 64 units. The applicants are proposing 18. Now, We quite often get schemes where the provision is below your requirement, and what's usually required is that the applicant submit a robust viability statement to demonstrate why they can't achieve a greater level of provision on the site. In this case, the applicant has submitted a viability statement, but it's not believed that that robustly defends the position which the applicants are currently putting forward. We therefore do not believe that adequate consideration has been given to the provision of affordable housing on this site. And again, an objection is raised accordingly. So, in conclusion, whilst the principle of residential development is acceptable, the current scheme suffers significant deficiencies in terms of its design, layout, affordable housing provision and wildlife mitigation, which are not sufficiently outweighed by the need for housing or the provision of a community woodland, such as to justify an approval. The proposal is therefore recommended for refusal. That recommendation is on pages 51 and 52 of the agenda, and I'd ask members to adopt that recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kingfisher.